Tuesday's primaries wrapped up with some notable wins across several states. New Jersey Democratic Congressman Andy Kim cruised to victory in the state's Senate primary race. Kim was seen as a favorite to challenge Senator Bob Menendez, who is facing corruption charges. Over in Iowa, Representatives Randy Feenstra and Marionette Miller Meeks were able to beat out challenges from hardline conservatives. And in Montana, Trump-backed Republican Tim Sheehy will officially go head-to-head against Democratic Senator Jon Tester. Joining me now to break down the winners and the losers of this week's primaries is the Hill's Niall Stanage. Niall, as always, thank you so much for being here. I want to take a closer look at New Jersey's primaries. And we saw that Andy Kim easily won that state's Democratic primary, but Trump took an unexpected blow, of course, after a few weeks after he held that very crowded rally in New Jersey. How did this play out on the Republican side?
There's a very interesting result here on the Republican side, Julia. Curtis Bashaw, a real estate developer, won the Republican nomination. And that was something of a disappointment to Mr. Trump, who'd backed another figure, a female former borough mayor, who was obviously defeated. So a bit of a blow there to Trump and a bit of a victory for the so-called Republican establishment. I guess that's a little bit unusual in this day and age where we've got accustomed to the former president's grip on the GOP being so strong. Obviously, New Jersey is home to former Governor Chris Christie, who has had many battles with Trump. I don't know if that is a factor or not, but clearly a defeat for the Trump-backed candidate here.
Yeah, and obviously on the Democratic side, there's quite a bit of drama because we know that New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez, who is currently facing corruption charges, filed to run as an independent this cycle. How much of a spoiler could he play for Andy Kim this November, Niall? And is there any possibility that he could pull this off and win?
I tend to think it's unlikely he could win just because of the nature of those corruption charges. Not only because, they are serious by their nature, but they're pretty lurid, or they tend to stick in the mind by the nature of the corruption charges, gold bars and things of that nature. Now, we should say that Senator Menendez, of course, pleads his innocence in that case. As far as his potential as a spoiler goes, that is, I think, a more difficult question to answer. Clearly, he could still get some votes, particularly if voters buy his argument that he has been falsely accused in this case. But I would say that New Jersey is fairly solidly Democratic territory. President Biden carried it by 16 points in 2020. So Andy Kim has a sort of built-in cushion as the Democratic candidate there. And that would be a sizable shock, I think, if he ended up being defeated.
Want to look out for other primary states, or other states who had primaries across the country last night. Several incumbents dodged primary upsets. What happened in Montana and Iowa?
Well, I think one of the key results in Montana was Tim Sheehy winning the Republican nomination to go up against Jon Tester this November. That is clearly an interesting race there because Republicans have very high hopes of taking that Senate seat. It's one of their top targets as they seek to regain control of the Senate. Mr. Sheehy's a former Navy SEAL. He seems well positioned, broadly speaking. But of course, Senator Tester has proven surprisingly resilient, it might be said, in a state that trends so heavily Republican.
So on the presidential side, President Trump is starting to see a trend as voters across several states continue to cast ballots for Nikki Haley, who obviously ended her campaign in March, and GOP rivals who are no longer in the race. Niall, could this have a major impact on Trump's 2024 chances? And does he have a plan to unify voters and go after Haley supporters now that she's said she would vote for him?
Well, this share of the vote that she's getting for a so-called zombie campaign, I think, is worrisome from the Trump perspective. We give a lot of attention to the sort of dissident vote on the Democratic side, perceived to be motivated by opposition to President Biden's policies in Gaza. But the Republican side, there is very clear evidence of a swathe of the Republican Party that is not yet reconciled to Mr. Trump as the GOP nominee. Now, whether he will seek to win them over in a sort of proactive way remains to be seen. I think the bigger hope is simply that come November, they will return to the fold of their own accord. They will prefer any Republican candidate, including Mr. Trump, over President Biden. But that's not guaranteed. And of course, the danger is some of those voters simply stay home.
Turning to foreign policy now, President Biden is putting all of his efforts behind a 6-week ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. But of course, it's leaving Biden in a tough spot with Democrats. Many on the left want him to place more pressure on Israel. But how much of an impact is his policy towards Israel playing with his support of progressives? And really, could it cost him the election, Niall, if these progressives do in fact stay home?
I really feel it could cost him the election. And I've been saying since a fairly early phase in this conflict in Gaza that I thought people were underestimating its potential impact on American domestic politics. It's not, Julia, that 50 or 60 or 90% of the American population is totally focused on what is happening in Gaza. But as your question alluded to, progressives are frankly pretty outraged by President Biden's staunch support of Israel through this conflict. And because it is a conflict that has cost many thousands of lives, it is felt so viscerally by American voters who feel passionately about it. It has the real impact to peel off part of President Biden's support. And I think that is a real danger come November.
Yeah, and a danger in states like Michigan, which is obviously a major swing state with a very key Arab American population. So the president is also facing blowback on his executive action on the southern border. Niall, how are Democrats and Republicans reacting to this move announced on Tuesday?
From the Republican side, the basic argument is that this is too little, too late. They argue that the president has simply failed to take control of the border. They point to the fact that there are many more unauthorized border crossings than there were during the Trump presidency. Now, Democrats say, well, the Trump presidency in its latter years was obviously affected by the pandemic, which held numbers artificially low. And they talk about the former president having essentially capsized a bipartisan immigration agreement earlier this year. On the Democratic side, once again, there's more of a divide. Some Democrats, I think, see the electoral necessity in trying to neutralize the issue of border security. There are some on the left who are upset because they feel that this new executive order cuts across a legitimate right of people, perhaps people in really grave danger, to claim asylum.
So with President Biden's policy on Israel and the border now front and center, could the president face a blowout victory by former President Trump if he's getting so much pushback on these two very key issues?
There is a thesis that he could, and it is largely to do with a lack of enthusiasm among the Democratic grassroots, coupled with, as we know, Mr. Trump having a very passionate support base. I personally am skeptical of the blowout argument because I just think that, firstly, we're such a polarized country that any nominee of a major party is almost automatically getting 45, 46%. And the other thing about the blowout argument is I think it underestimates the number of Americans who frankly loathe Mr. Trump and just would vote for almost anyone else other than him. So I doubt there'll be a blowout, but stranger things have happened.
Absolutely. Trump, obviously a major motivating factor for a lot of voters, as you and Democratic strategists have pointed out in recent days. So moving to Capitol Hill, but sticking with foreign policy, the House this week voted to punish the International Criminal Court for its plan to bring war crime charges against Israeli leaders. How is this splitting Democrats, Niall, and would this have had any chance of clearing the Democratic-controlled Senate?
So to answer the second part first, it's regarded as having a very slim chance of clearing the Senate, where a significant number of Democratic senators would need to back it. In the House, it has divided Democrats quite severely because there were, I think 42 is the correct number, there were certainly a significant number of Democrats who voted to sanction the International Criminal Court over its request for arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Now, clearly, the left of the Democratic Party is not in agreement with that whatsoever. They frankly welcome the request for arrest warrants. And of course, these tensions, Julia, aren't going to go anywhere anytime soon, because we know that Mr. Netanyahu, of course, has been invited to address Congress. There seems to be some lack of clarity as regards the actual date. But clearly, you're going to see progressives boycott that speech when it happens, even as pro-Israel Democrats presumably welcome the Israeli Prime Minister.
That will certainly be an interesting day to watch on Capitol Hill. Niall Stanage, as always, thank you so much for your insight.
Thanks, Julia.
A gunman is in custody after opening fire outside the U.S. Embassy in Lebanon and injuring an embassy security guard. The shootout reportedly lasted almost half an hour. The gunman was eventually shot and taken into custody by Lebanese soldiers. It comes as fighting between Israeli troops and Hezbollah militants have forced thousands of people out of their homes near the Israeli border. It's still unclear what motivated the attack, but the gunman reportedly wore a black vest with the words Islamic State written in Arabic. Columbia University is settling a suit this week that alleged the school did not provide a safe educational environment for Jewish students. It comes after the recent pro-Palestinian protests at the school. Those protests faced accusations of anti-Semitism and drew criticism from congressional leaders. In the settlement, the school agreed to designate a safe passage liaison to help students with safety concerns. They also agreed to accommodations for students who missed assignments and exams due to the protests. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hills YouTube channel. And come back here next time for the intersection between politics and policy.